The morning the great hall at Edenholm filled with the county gentry, every chair set out in rows beneath the cold north windows. The woman they had all come to dispute walked the length of the stone floor without once dropping her eyes. She wore grey wool, plain at the cuff, and gloves mended at one finger, and the heels of her shoes had been worn down on harder roads than any of these people had traveled. She did not curtsy to the high seats. She came to the long oak table where the county magistrate sat with his clerks. She set down a flat leather case bound twice with a strap, and she waited for the room to grow quiet enough to hear her. It took a long time. The whispering did not stop because she asked it to. It stopped because she did not. At the front of the hall, in the chair nearest the fire, an old woman in black bombazine watched her with a stillness that was not calm. The dowager had ruled this country these 20 years, and she had cast this very face out of this very house 3 winters past, in the rain, with 3 small girls clinging to her skirts and a single trunk roped to the back of a hired gig. The dowager had been so certain then. She was certain now. What she had not counted on, what no one in that hall had counted on, was the seal of red wax the size of a man's palm, pressed into the foot of the document inside that leather case, and the name written above it in a hand that no magistrate in the kingdom could overrule. Let me tell you how a woman comes to carry such a thing across 200 miles of winter road, and why she did not so much as glance at the husband seated 3 rows back, though she felt his eyes on her the whole length of that floor. Her name was Verity Ashby before it was anything grander, and she had come to Edenholm as a bride at 20, the daughter of a clergyman, with more books than living, married for the small fortune her godmother had left her, and for the steadiness everyone said she possessed. The steadiness was real. The fortune was spent within 2 years on the roof of the west wing and the draining of the low fields, and afterward she had nothing to recommend her to the house but her body's single appointed task, and her body, in the eyes of the dowager, had failed it 3 times over. She had borne 3 daughters. Ophelia first, in the spring of her 2nd year of marriage, a long labor that left her gray for a month. Then Susanna, 2 years after, on a night so cold the water froze in the basin between the nurse's hands. Then, last, little Beatrice, who came early and small and lived only because her mother would not sleep for 9 days together. 3 daughters, and not 1 son, and an entail upon the estate that ran by the old law to heirs male of the body, and failing them, sideways and out of the direct line altogether, to a cousin nobody at Edenholm had laid eyes on in a decade. To the county after the 3rd girl, she was simply the barren countess. They knew it was the wrong word. They used it anyway because it was shorter than the truth, and it fit the shape of what they had decided about her. A woman with 3 living children, and the country called her barren, and meant by it that she had failed to produce the 1 child that would have made the others count. She had loved her husband. This is the part the county never troubled to learn. Alaric Carberry had been a quiet, exact man when she married him, not cold so much as carefully banked. A man who had buried a younger brother at 16, and learned from it that the things he wanted allowed were the things the world took from him soonest. He had not wanted her allowed. Even so, she had seen the way he stood at the nursery door when he thought himself unobserved, watching Ophelia sleep with a look on his face like a man at a window in winter. And she had built her whole hope on that look, and on the few times his hand had found hers across the breakfast table without his seeming to decide to do it. The trouble came the year his health broke. A fever in the lungs that nearly took him, that left him bedridden through 1 whole autumn, and into that autumn, while he lay weak and half out of his senses, his mother moved like water finding the low ground. The dowager had never wanted the clergyman's daughter. She had wanted an alliance, a bloodline, a son. And she saw in her son's illness that if he died without a male heir, the estate would pass to the cousin, and that the cousin, a sharp and idle man named Felton Drake, could be managed, befriended, made grateful, in a way her son's plain wife never had been, and never would be. So the dowager began to tell a story. She told it first to the rector, in the privacy of the morning room, her voice low and grieved. "She does not love him," the dowager said, turning a ring upon her finger. She married for the name, and now that the name may come to nothing. She looks elsewhere. I have seen it. A mother sees these things. The rector carried it as such things are carried, not as malice but as concern, and within a fortnight the country had a new shape ready for the clergyman's daughter, and it was uglier than barren. What she did not yet know, lying awake those nights beside the door of her husband's sick room, listening for the rhythm of his breathing to break, was that the same story had been carried to Alaric himself, dripped into his fevered ear in the long dark hours by the one voice he had trusted his whole life. That his wife was cold, that his wife was waiting, that his wife had been seen more than once walking the East Avenue with the cousin's land agent, her head bent close to his. None of it was true. All of it was built from true pieces, the way the cruelest lies are. She had walked the East Avenue. She had spoken with the agent. She had been begging him, in fact, to hold off the dunning of a tenant family she could not bear to see turned out before Christmas, and she had bent her head close, because the man was deaf in one ear. The dowager knew all of this. The dowager told it anyway. He recovered, slowly through the back end of that winter. And the man who rose from the sickbed was not the man who had taken to it. Something in him had been moved, like a stone shifted in a wall, and the whole structure had changed its bearing. He no longer came to the nursery door. He no longer let his hand drift toward hers at the table. When she spoke to him, he answered in single words, level and far away. And she told herself it was the lingering weakness, and she was wrong. And she went on being wrong for the better part of a year, while the distance between them set like frost in the ground. The morning he cast her out, it was raining. She had not expected it, which she would think of afterward as the great foolishness of her whole life, that she had not seen it coming. He sent for her to the library, and he stood with his back to her, at the tall window, looking out at the wet park, and he did not turn around. "I have made arrangements," he said. "There is a house at Holt on the edge of the property. You will be comfortable there. The girls will be provided for." His voice did not shake. That was the thing she could not forgive for a long time. That his voice did not shake. "I think it best you go this week." She had asked him why. She had stood in that beautiful, cold room, with her hands folded so they would not betray her, and she had asked him to look at her and tell her what she had done, and he had not turned from the window, and he had said only, "I think you know." And because she did not know, because there was nothing to know, she had understood at last that something had been put into him that she could not reach, and she had gathered her daughters and what was hers, and she had gone. She had not wept where the servants could see. She had stood in the wet courtyard while the one trunk was roped to the back of the hired gig, and the under-housemaid who had dressed her hair for 3 years had pressed a small wrapped parcel of bread and cheese into her hands and could not meet her eyes, and the dowager had watched the whole of it from a first-floor window, a still black shape behind the glass, and had not come down. She had wept in the gig, on the road to Holt, with all 3 girls pressed against her, and the rain coming through the canvas, Beatrice asking over and over where they were going, and Ophelia, who was old enough to understand that something had broken that would not be mended soon, saying nothing at all and holding her mother's sleeve in one cold fist. And somewhere on that road, between 1 mile of standing water and the next, she had made herself a single promise, which was that no one would ever again decide what she was worth without hearing her speak. If you have ever been told what you are by people too comfortable to look at you closely, stay with me, because this is the part where she stopped accepting their account. The house at Holt was small and damp, and stood at the very margin of the estate where the cultivated land gave way to the open moor. The roof leaked over the back bedroom, and the chimney drew badly in a north wind, and the nearest neighbor was a shepherd half a mile off, who left a brace of rabbits on the step in the hard months, and never knocked. There was an old woman, Mrs. Pruitt, who came with the house, a former dairymaid pensioned off and forgotten, her hands knotted with the rheumatism and her tongue plain as a spade. And she became, in the years that followed, the nearest thing the cast-out wife had to an ally. The first night, when the fire would not catch, and Beatrice cried with the cold, and the other 2 stood white-faced in the doorway, it was Mrs. Botter. Pruett, who knelt at the grate and coaxed the green wood into flame, and said, without turning round, "We have had worse winters than this one will be, my lady, and we are still here to complain of them." It was the first kindness anyone had shown, the three of them in a fortnight, and her mistress had to turn to the dark window so the children would not see her face. They lived plainly after that, and learned too. She taught her three girls their letters and their figures herself, at a deal table by the one good window, with a slate that had to be wiped and used again because there was no money for paper that was not wanted for the case. She taught them other things too, things she had not known she knew, until she had no money and three children and a name the county used like a slur. She taught them that a person is not what a room decides she is. She taught them to keep their accounts to the farthing, and Ophelia, who was the eldest and the gravest, took to it with a fierceness that frightened her a little, totting the week's spending in a ruled book and reading the sum aloud at supper like a small magistrate. She taught them to mend so that the mending did not show, and to walk into the village with their heads level, whatever was said behind them, which was a great deal, for the county had not forgotten whose daughters they were. And in the long evenings, when the girls were asleep in the one warm room and the moor wind worked at the loose slates overhead, she taught herself the law. It began with the entail. She had carried out of Edenholme, almost by accident, in the bottom of a workbox, a copy of the settlement her own marriage articles had referred to, and one wet October she read it through, and read it again, and a third time with Mrs. Pruett holding the candle. And in the dense old language of it, in a clause everyone at Edenholme had stopped reading 2 generations back, because it had never signified, she found a single sentence that made her set the paper down and press her cold hands flat against the table to stop them trembling. The entail ran to heirs, male of the body. Everyone knew that. Beneath it, though, the original grant, the very first creation of the barony 200 years before, contained a saving clause, a provision that in the failure of heirs male, and only upon a petition allowed by the Crown, the dignity and the estate together might descend to and through the heirs female of the body, the daughters of the line. 1b and their order of birth. It had never been invoked. It had never needed to be. In 2 centuries there had always been a son somewhere to take it. Now the clause sat there, in the King's own original grant, and what the King's grant had reserved to the Crown, only the Crown could now release, not the dowager, not the cousin, not even the magistrate of the county. Only the sovereign by his signature upon a petition properly brought. She understood at once what it would cost to bring it. A woman of no fortune, cast out and slandered, petitioning the Crown to overturn the expectations of a powerful family in favor of 3 little girls, living on a moor. It was very nearly impossible. Nearly. She had learned, in 3 years of being nearly nothing, exactly how much room there was inside the word nearly. She began to write letters. She wrote to her late godmother's man of business in the city, who remembered her, and who agreed cautiously to make inquiries. She wrote to a barrister he named, and when the first declined the matter as hopeless, she wrote to a second, a careful young man with no family and a great deal of ambition, named Mr. Carr. Sale, who read her copy of the grant, and wrote back a single line that she kept folded against her heart for a year. "The clause is good," he wrote. "Whether the Crown will move is another question, but the clause is good." She sold her godmother's pearls to retain him. She sold the last of the plate Mrs. Pruett took in sewing from the village, and would not be argued out of it. And for 2 years, while the county forgot her and the dowager grew comfortable, and the cousin came down twice a year to walk the property he already thought of as his own, Verity built her case in a damp house on the edge of the moor, 1 document at a time. She gathered the parish registers proving her daughter's births and her own marriage. She gathered the marriage articles. She procured at no small difficulty a certified copy of the original grant from the records in the city, so that no one could say her own paper was false. And she did one thing more. The thing that would matter most at the end, though she could not have known it then. She wrote down in her own hand, with dates and places, the whole true account of her walks on the East Avenue and her dealings with the land agent, and she persuaded that agent, an honest man burdened by a thing he had half understood and never meant, to set his own name to it. He remembered the conversations. He remembered she had pleaded for the tenants. Not for herself. He signed. The cousin was not idle while she worked. This is the part the county would only learn later. Drake had ears at Edenholme, and one of those ears caught wind. That second autumn, that the cast-out wife was spending money she did not appear to have on lawyers in the city. He did not know the shape of what she intended. He was a careful man, however, where his own interest was concerned, and careful men do not wait to learn the whole of a danger before they prepare against it. He retained counsel of his own. He procured, quietly, a written opinion that the saving clause was void for uncertainty, an opinion he could produce at need. And he did something a great deal worse than that, something that would not come to light until the very hour it failed. The petition went up in the spring of the 3rd year. Mr. Connaught Sale carried it himself, with the certified grant and the registers and the articles, through the offices and the antechambers and the long indifference of clerks, up and up through the machinery that stood between a Morehouse and the throne. He wrote to her at intervals, brief, honest letters that promised nothing, and she read each one twice, and then a third time aloud to Mrs. Pruitt by the fire, weighing every cautious phrase for a thread of hope. A petition lodged. A petition referred. A petition, in the autumn, before the law officers for their opinion, which Mr. Sale wrote might mean a month or might mean a year, there being no way to hurry men who answered to no one. It took 11 months. There were times Verity was certain it had died in some pigeonhole, and no one would ever trouble to tell her. There were times she lay awake, doing the sum of what she had spent and what remained, which was nothing, which was less than nothing, and asked herself whether she had gambled her daughter's last security on a sentence 2 centuries old. Then, in the deep of the following winter, on a morning when the snow had closed the road to the village, a rider came up to the Morehouse with a packet sealed in red wax the size of a man's palm, and Mrs. Pruitt had to take it from his hands, because her mistress's own had gone numb. The king had signed. By his own hand, upon the humble petition before him, having taken the advice of his law officers, His Majesty was graciously pleased to allow the descent of the dignity and the estate of Edenholme to and through the heirs female of the body of the late Grant, the daughters in their order of birth, with all that pertained thereto. It was done. It was real, it was unanswerable, by anyone in the county of York or out of it. She sat down at the deal table with the document open before her, and she did not weep. This time, she read it 11 times. Then she folded it into the flat leather case she had bought against this day, and she bound the case twice with a strap, and she began to plan the journey home. She did not write ahead. She had learned, on the road to Holt 3 winters before, what advance notice did for a woman with no power. It gave her enemies time. So she came, without warning, in the gray light of a wet February afternoon, in a hired chaise this time and not a gig, and she left her daughters safe at an inn in the market town with Mrs. Track, Pruitt standing guard, because whatever happened at Edenholme, she would not have them in that hall to see it. She came with Mr. Dinting Sale, and she presented herself at the magistrate's door and laid the matter before him plainly. And the magistrate, an old and cautious man who had known her father, read the document through twice and went gray himself, and said the only thing the law allowed him to say. He would convene the gentry, he would read it before the county. The thing was too great to be done in a corner. Word ran ahead of the day, the way fire runs through dry gorse. By the morning the hall was set out with its rows of chairs. Half the county had come, and the dowager sat in the chair nearest the fire in her black bombazine, and the cousin stood at her shoulder with his counsel beside him, and a leather folder of his own under his arm, and 3 rows back where he could see and not be seen, sat the man who had not spoken to his wife in 3 years. She felt him before she saw him. That was the cruelty of it, that her body knew him across a crowded hall before her eyes had found him, the old animal knowledge that had never once obeyed her. She did not look. She walked the length of the floor in her gray wool and her mended gloves. She set down the case on the magistrate's table, and she waited for the room to quiet, and it quieted, and the magistrate broke the seal. Before he could begin, the dowager spoke from her chair by the fire. Not loudly, but pitched so that the front rows would carry it back. "Let us not pretend this is anything but what it is," she said, her chin high, her voice steady with 20 years of being obeyed. "A barren woman come back to seize an estate she could not give an heir to. The county knows her. The county has always known her." A murmur of agreement moved through the chairs nearest the fire. The old comfortable verdict closing over the room like water, and the magistrate had to wait for it to settle before he could break the seal. He read it aloud, then the whole of it, in the flat, careful voice of a man who knows that every word he speaks is undoing a settled world. The hall was silent in a way that hurt the ears. When he came to the king's allowance, to the descent through the heirs female of the body, a sound went through the rows like wind through standing grain, and the dowager's hand closed on the arm of her chair until the knuckles stood out white as bone, and somewhere behind the woman in gray, a chair scraped sharply on the stone. And she did not turn to see whose. The cousin did not wait for the reading to end before he moved. He stepped forward into the open floor with the practiced ease of a man who has rehearsed this, his counsel beside him, and he addressed not his cousin's wife, but the room, which was the cleverest thing he could have done. "This is a forgery," he said, "or worse, a fraud upon the crown itself." He opened his folder. He had the written opinion that the saving clause was void, and he laid it on the table. He had a second paper, and this was the thing he had done that was worse than retaining lawyers, and he laid that down too, and his voice rose to carry to the back of the hall. "I hold here a sworn deposition, taken before a magistrate of my own county, of a witness who will say that this woman, 3 winters past, abandoned her husband and her marriage of her own free will for the company of another man. A woman who deserts her hearth does not return to it on the strength of a clause she has gulled the crown into signing. She comes back for the money. Read the deposition. It is sworn. It is witnessed. It names her." It was an ambush, and a good one. He had not denied the document outright, which would have been hopeless against the king's own seal. He had instead poisoned the well, set the whole hall to remembering the old story, the cold wife, the deserted husband, the walks on the East Avenue, and dressed that old slander in the new authority of an oath. The room turned. She could feel it turn. The sympathy that had begun to gather toward the woman in gray wool curdling back into the comfortable old verdict. The dowager, by the fire, let out a long breath, and her shoulders eased because her son's silence 3 rows back was the deposition's loudest corroboration, and everyone in that hall knew it. The woman in gray stood very still in the center of the floor. She had known he would fight. She had not known the shape of it, but she had known a man does not surrender 200 years of expectation without an active defense, and she had built for this, in the damp house on the moor, the one thing that no rehearsed ambush could withstand, which was the truth set down at the time by the only people who had been there. She did not raise her voice to match his. She turned to the magistrate. "The deposition my husband's cousin offers," she said, and her voice was low and even and reached every corner of that silent hall, "is sworn by a witness who was not present at any walk on the East Avenue, and who knows what he knows from the dowager's own account. I do not ask you to take my word against his. I ask you to read the words of the only man who walked beside me there." And she drew from inside the leather case a single folded paper, and she laid it on the table beside the cousin's, and the magistrate took it up. It was the land agent's statement, signed and dated 3 years past, in his own clumsy, honest hand. It set out the day, and the tenant family at risk of turning out before Christmas, and the deafness in his one ear that had brought her head close to his, and the exact words she had said, which were a plea for mercy on people poorer than herself. It named the dowager as the one who had questioned him afterward, who had asked him leading things, who had gone away and built from his answers a story he did not recognize when at last he heard it whole. The magistrate read it aloud. And as he read, the hall turned again, and this time it did not turn back. Because the agent had nothing to gain, and had signed his name to a thing that shamed a powerful family. And the county knew the difference between a paid deposition and a confession given against a man's own interest. The cousin's counsel leaned to his ear. The cousin's face had gone the color of tallow. He reached for the written opinion on the clause, the void for uncertainty argument, his last ground. And Mr. Tumida. Sale stepped forward at last with the certified grant in his hand and laid the original language open before the magistrate. The king's own words aloud and confirmed by the king's own present signature. And there was no opinion of any council in the kingdom that could stand against the sovereign's allowance of his own grant. It was over. The whole hall understood it was over a moment before the magistrate said so, in the particular quality of the silence that follows a thing that cannot be taken back. It was then that the man 3 rows back stood up. He came into the open floor slowly, and the county that had not seen him cross a room in 3 years watched him do it now. He was thinner than he had been, and there was gray at his temples that the fever had put there. And he stopped a little distance from her, closer than propriety, strictly allowed. And for the first time in 3 years, and across the whole length of that hall, the clergyman's daughter looked her husband full in the face. What she saw there undid something she had spent 3 years setting hard. It was not triumph, and it was not relief. It was grief, plain and terrible, the grief of a man who has just heard read aloud the exact measure of the wrong he did on the word of the one voice he should never have trusted. He did not make a speech. The voice that had not shaken when it cast her out shook now once. Before he mastered it, "Verity," he said, and the use of her name, her own given name in his mouth after 3 years of being nothing and no one, went through her like cold water and warm light at once. He said it again, turned now to the magistrate and to the rows of chairs and to his mother by the fire in a voice he made carry. "This is my wife. These are my daughter's rights, and I will defend them against any man." That was all. A handful of plain words after the name. A man does not need more than that, when he says it where the whole world can hear, in the room where the whole world watched him send her away. The dowager rose from her chair by the fire. For one moment, the old certainty held her upright, the 20 years of rule, and she opened her mouth to speak. And then she looked at her son's face, and she looked at the land agent's statement open on the magistrate's table with her own name written in it. And the certainty went out of her like breath out of a struck animal. She did not rail. She did not beg. She put one hand on the back of the chair to steady herself, and she said to no one, in a voice gone suddenly old, "I thought I was protecting him." It was not an apology. It was something worse and truer than an apology, the confession of a person who has just discovered that the thing she did for love was the thing that very nearly destroyed what she loved. She sat back down. She did not speak again that day. And no one in the hall, not even the woman she had wronged, found it in themselves to gloat. Because there is no triumph to be had in watching a proud old woman learn she has been wrong her whole life in the one matter she cared about most. Drake gathered his folder and his counsel and went out of the hall without another word. And he was not seen in that country again, and the property he had spent 10 years counting as his own passed out of his reckoning forever. The magistrate confirmed the king's allowance into the county record. The thing was law. There remained the matter between a husband and a wife, and that was not settled in the hall, and ought not to have been, he did not presume. That was the thing she had not expected, and the thing that began at last, to thaw the frost she had carried up from the moor. He did not take her hand in the hall and play the reconciled husband for the county's benefit. He asked low, with the whole weight of 3 wasted years in it, whether he might call upon her where she was lodged, and bring her daughters home himself, if she would permit it, and abide entirely by her answer. She permitted the call. She did not promise the rest. She had not come 200 miles and spent her godmother's pearls to be grateful for the return of a thing that had been hers by right all along. He came to the inn the next morning, in the gray light, with no servants and no show. and he stood a moment in the low doorway of the parlor as though he were not certain of his welcome. Which he was not. Mrs. Truett looked him up and down once. The whole of him, the grey at his temples and the hat held in both hands. And whatever she saw she kept to herself. And she gathered the 3 girls and took them out into the yard with a word about the geese. The eldest paused at the threshold and looked back at the strange, thin man who was her father, a long, grave look with her mother's steadiness in it. And then she went. He watched the door close behind them, and something moved in his face that he did not try to hide. He sat at a plain table across from her, then his hands flat on the scrubbed wood, and he did not defend himself. He told her the whole of what had been done to him in the sick room, in the long, fevered dark, the voice he had trusted dripping its poison while he lay too weak to lift his head, the certainty it had built in him a grain at a time until he could no longer tell the thing he had been told from a thing he had seen. He did not offer it as an excuse. "I should have asked you," he said. "I stood at that window and I should have turned around and asked you. And I did not, because I was afraid the answer would be the one I had been told to expect. And I have paid 3 years for being a coward at a window, and you have paid more." He looked at his hands. "I do not ask you to forget it. I ask whether there is any road back from it, and I will walk as much of that road on my knees as you require." She was quiet for a long time. Outside in the yard she could hear Ophelia's voice, grave and clear, telling her sisters to mind the puddles. The voice of a child who had learned to keep accounts to the farthing, and to know her own worth in a damp house at the edge of the world. She thought of the woman who had wept in a gig in the rain 3 winters past, and of the promise she had made that no one would ever again decide what she was worth without hearing her speak. She had spoken. The king himself had heard her, and the man across the table was not deciding her worth now. He was asking after it with his hands open on the wood, waiting on her answer the way she had once waited on his breathing in the dark. "There is a road," she said at last. "It is long, and you will walk most of it, and you will never again stand at a window with your back to me when something is wrong between us. You will turn around. You will ask." She let the breath go out of her slowly. "And you will know your daughters, all 3. By name and by nature, not as a disappointment that became a deliverance. They are not a clause that saved you. They are Ophelia, and Susanna, and Beatrice, and they are remarkable, and you have 3 years of them to learn." He said her name once more, only her name, and this time there was nothing of grief in it, and nothing of ceremony, only a man saying the thing he had been too afraid to say at a window 3 years before. She let him take her hand across the table. It was the same hand that had once drifted toward hers at a breakfast table, and then learned not to, and she felt the old current run up her arm, and did not pretend this time that she had not felt it. They went home to Edenholme together that afternoon, the chaise coming up the long avenue in a light that had finally cleared, and the 3 girls pressed to the windows naming the rooks and the bare elms. The house that had cast her out received her now as its mistress in her own right and her daughter's right, which no settlement could ever again unsettle. The dowager kept to her own apartments through that first spring, and then slowly came out of them. And the thing that grew between the old woman and the granddaughters she had nearly thrown away was the one mercy in the whole affair that surprised everyone, including the dowager herself, who learned in her last years to be glad, fiercely and humbly glad, that she had failed. By the following Christmas, the low fields her godmother's fortune had drained ran green again under snow, and there was a fire in every grate of the west wing, and a small worn copy of an old grant, the very paper she had read by candlelight on a wet October night 3 years before, lay folded in a drawer of the morning room where she could put her hand on it when she wished to remember. She did not take it out often. She did not need to. The proof of what she had done was not in the paper. It was in the sound of 3 girls' voices through the wall, and in a husband who turned around now whenever she came into a room, and in the particular silence of a great house that had at last learned, too late and only just in time, exactly what it had nearly let walk out into the rain. If her journey moved you, stay a moment at the end of it, and remember the woman in the gig on the road to Holt, who decided in the rain that her worth was hers, to prove, and no one else's to deny, and carried that decision 200 miles and 3 long winters to the foot of a throne. Thank you for staying with her to the end.